Julian Sterling observed that there is a voice within every psyche that decides everything before the subject even realizes they have decided. It chooses the words before the mouth opens. It negotiates what is possible before the opportunity even arrives. It writes the future with the ink of the past, and almost no one listens to it. This is the loudest silence in human life, the sound of an internal dialogue that governs an entire destiny without ever being questioned. The difference between those who flourish and those who rot in the same soil is not money. It is not luck. It is not inherited talent. It is something quieter, more subterranean, more archetypal. It is the quality of what one says to oneself when no one is listening. It is the way the psyche addresses its own psyche when the world falls silent, and until this phenomenon becomes conscious, it directs life. And the subject calls it fate. This is a transmission about the 7 crossings that return the authorship of thought to the individual, about how Sterling mapped the silent alchemy between the inner voice and the outer life, about what changes when someone stops being narrated and starts to narrate. There is a statistic that haunts anyone who stops to consider it. The human psyche goes through tens of thousands of thoughts a day, and the overwhelming majority of them are exactly the same as the day before. The mind repeats. It repeats phrases. It repeats fears. It repeats scenes. It repeats judgments about itself that were pronounced by others decades ago and that continue to echo as if they were oracles. It is impossible to build a new life with old conversations. Impossible. And yet that is exactly what most people try to do every day, hoping that something changes on the outside while keeping intact what is whispered on the inside. Sterling observed that what does not become conscious returns as fate. This is not a decorative phrase. It is a clinical diagnosis of human existence. Everything the individual refuses to see in their own psyche manifests as an external event. What is repeated in the internal dialogue crystallizes in the dialogue with the world. There are ordinary people who rehearse failure 20 times before breakfast. They internally reproduce the worst-case scenario, articulate the humiliation that hasn't happened yet, and anticipate the rejection that may never come. And there are others, rare ones, who rehearse the exit, who talk to themselves like someone preparing a student before an exam, with patience, with method, with faith. The difference between these two lives does not lie in the facts. It lies in the conversation. Comment the word alchemy if you recognize this phenomenon happening inside you right now. Not as a light affirmation, as a recognition that something is being transmuted while this video is being watched. Alchemy, from Sterling's perspective, is not an ornamental metaphor. It is the process by which the lead of inherited dialogue is converted into the gold of chosen dialogue. And it begins, always, with a single word spoken softly to one's own chest. Most human beings operate with mental software they did not install. Sterling perceived this with terrible clarity. What is called personality is, to a large extent, a file of alien voices passing themselves off as one's own voice. The mother in Oak Creek who said her child doesn't give up. The father in Birmingham who said men don't cry. The teacher in Maplewood who said that child had no head for numbers. The neighborhood in East River that said no one escapes from there. Each of these phrases was recorded before the psyche had defenses to filter them, and they continue running in the background decades later, sustaining an identity that perhaps doesn't even belong to the individual inhabiting it. The persona in this reading is the technical name for what one believes oneself to be, and it is almost never who one truly is. The most common programs in this operating system have names that anyone recognizes. I am not enough, I always fail, I can't, I don't deserve it. They appear disguised as spontaneous thoughts, but they are not. They are old scripts, executed in a loop, written by people who may have already died and who continue, through this repetition, governing the choreography of the days. And the cruelest part is that external life begins to confirm these phrases, because the unconscious projects into the world that which it refuses to integrate. As Sterling observed, what is internal and not made conscious appears from the outside as fate. If you are someone who grew up being called too sensitive, he knew. If you feel that you carry a seriousness disproportionate to your age, he knew. If you are a late bloomer and realized early on that you would not flourish at the collective pace, he knew. If you have suspected for a long time that there is an unlived life inside you, denser, more real, more yours, he knew. If you recognize yourself as a rare personality who always had the feeling of walking out of step, he knew. These psychological characteristics are not defects, they are the terrain of individuation. They are the signs of someone who is summoned to remake the conversation that others started inside them. There is a silent villain in this story, and it is not external. It is the unintegrated shadow, everything that the subject refused to see in themselves and which continues, for that very reason, directing their life without permission. Sterling used to say that the more one ignores their own shadow, the darker their fate becomes. Not as a punishment. By psychic physics. What is denied inside manifests outside. What is not said consciously to oneself is said unconsciously to the world, and the world responds in the same language. And here is the point where many get stuck, because reading Sterling is one thing, recognizing oneself in Sterling is another, but integrating Sterling, embodying Sterling, going through the process of individuation in the flesh of one's own days, that is what separates those who understand from those who are transformed by understanding. There are people who carry entire volumes of archetypal theory in their heads, and yet get up every day saying the same inherited phrases, living the same projections, repeating the same scenes. Knowing is not enough. The psyche does not change through intellectual accumulation. It changes through the crossing. Your shadow is directing your life and you call it bad luck. Another year of pretending, and it will break you for good. The awakening code consists of the 28 keys that Sterling did not finish. The complete system of applied individuation is in the first pinned comment. There are 28 keys structured into modules of guided active imagination with a closed circle of fellow travelers. There is a record of a man named Arthur from Seattle who for 12 years reread Sterling without ever being able to apply a single concrete integration, and who in 90 days within the system went through the first complex inversion of his own biography. What years of solitary reading failed to deliver, structured integration provides. Vacancies are limited because the work is intimate. There is a refund policy for those who do not recognize change. For those who are ready, access is in the first pinned comment. Read it before it hurts more. But first, let the next layer of this be revealed, because even what has just been said is deliberately partial. There is a stratification in the process of individuation that does not fit in a video, and which needs to be seen to be believed. What is recognized intellectually in 25 minutes requires months to be psychically embodied, and it is exactly there in this hiatus between what is understood and what is lived that the suffering of most of Sterling's readers resides. That is why the system exists, not to teach Sterling again, to help cross through him. And now returning to the central crossing of this encounter, the 7 phases of rewriting the internal dialogue that reorganize the psyche from the inside out. The first 2 days are for awareness and interruption. From Sterling's perspective, nothing is transformed before being seen, so the initial work is not to change anything. It is to listen. Listen to how you talk to yourself upon waking up. Listen to the phrase that appears before the mirror. Listen to what you say when something goes wrong, when someone doesn't answer a message, when you cross a social space and feel exposed. Listen to the internal critic, like someone listening to an old tenant who lives inside their own house without paying rent. What are the 3 phrases that repeat the most? At what moments do they appear? What voice do they have? Whose voice is it really? Because in the overwhelming majority of cases, it is not yours, it is inherited. And when the inherited thought appears, the technique is simple. Interrupt it. Say internally, stop, cancel, erase. It is not about denying the emotion. It is about not allowing the old script to finish being executed. Take a deep breath and offer the psyche a substitute phrase. Where before there was always I ruin everything, install I learn from every crossing. Where there was I am a failure, install I am in the middle of an alchemy that has not yet finished. Interruption is not violence against oneself. It is hospitality toward the part of oneself that deserves a better discourse. Write in the comments, I speak to who I am becoming, not as an ornamental mantra, as an archetypal declaration that there is a future version of you that needs to be addressed today so that it can exist tomorrow. This phrase, repeated with seriousness, reorganizes the relationship between ego and self. It reorganizes who is the subject of one's own sentence. Days 3 and 4 are for transformation and reframing. Here the psyche learns to talk to itself as it would talk to someone it loves. Sterling observed that most human beings are capable of extraordinary compassion for the suffering of others and implacable cruelty toward their own. This imbalance is not a virtue, it is a symptom. It is the sign of a psyche that learned to hate itself to survive some missing affection. The archetypal question of these days is simple and devastating. Would I speak like this to someone I love? If the answer is no, then the phrase needs to die, not because the suffering doesn't exist, but because the suffering deserves a better interlocutor. Reframing is alchemy applied to the internal lexicon. Where before there was, "This is too hard," install, "This is strengthening me." Where there was, "I don't know what to do," install, "I am learning what I need." Where there was, "I am late," install, "I am at my own pace." This last phrase in particular is decisive for those who are late bloomers, because collective time is not individual time. The external calendar was never the calendar of the psyche. Flourishing out of season is one of the most discreet marks of genuine individuation. Days 5, 6, and 7 are for elevation and incarnation, and here the work becomes, at the same time, more subtle and more radical. The psyche begins to converse with its own future self, not with a narcissistic fantasy of success, with the archetype of what has not yet been but which is pressing to be born. How does this more whole version of you think? How does it face a bad night? How does it respond to a frustration? How does it talk to itself in front of a bathroom mirror at 3 in the morning when no one sees? The answer to these questions is the script to be rehearsed today, to speak today with seriousness, as the person you are becoming would speak tomorrow. This is the simplest and most archetypal gesture of the entire crossing. Along with this, elevated emotions need to be activated. Gratitude, inspiration, confidence, love, enthusiasm, not as a positive performance, as alchemical fuel. The psyche does not change only through the word. It changes through the word impregnated with emotion. A cold, repeated phrase reorganizes nothing. A vibrant, repeated phrase reorganizes everything. Sterling knew this when he said that emotion is the main portal between the conscious and the unconscious. One does not cross this portal with indifference. Gratitude, in particular, operates a structural inversion in psychic attention, where before there was a focus on what is missing, a focus on what already exists is installed. Where before there was the recognition of the unreceived, the recognition of what is being built, what is being become, what is arriving because one is finally ready to receive, is installed. I am grateful for everything I am building. I am grateful for who I am becoming. Opportunities reach me because I have finally become their frequency. These are not empty affirmations. They are archetypal declarations of a change in internal polarity. And the body responds. This is the point that usually surprises. The psyche is not an upper floor disconnected from the lower floor. When the internal conversation changes, the nervous system registers it. Sleep improves, breathing deepens, chronic tension in the shoulders begins to give way. Concentration returns as if a background noise had been turned off. Anxiety decreases not because the world disappeared, but because the narrator changed. The body is the registry office of the unconscious. Everything the psyche repeats for years, it signs. Change what is repeated, and it begins to sign something else. Relationships also change, and they change before the subject notices. Because when someone stops attacking themselves from the inside, they stop defending themselves from everything on the outside. Defensiveness gives way. Listening opens up. Presence becomes available. People, without knowing why, begin to perceive a different frequency. Some move closer, others move away. Both movements are good, because when the internal conversation reorganizes, the system of relations reorganizes with it. What was held by projection is released, what was attracted by lack dissolves, and what remains is more real. Comment: I speak to who I am becoming. Repeat this declaration if it is lighting up in you right now, because what is named out loud or in writing gains a different ontological density than what is merely thought. But it is necessary to speak of resistance, because it will come. Sterling said that every conscious approach to the unconscious awakens an equal and opposite reaction. The more serious the work, the more intense the resistance will be. Days will appear when the old voice seems to return with redoubled force. Doubt will appear as to whether anything is really changing. Moments will appear when one will want to give up, precisely because something is about to change. Resistance is not a sign of failure, it is a sign of proximity. It is the last cry of the old identity trying to preserve the place it has always occupied. And the work in those days is not to overcome resistance by force. It is to recognize it as part of the process and return to the new dialogue the following morning without seeking perfection. There are advanced techniques that enhance the entire cycle. Sustained visualization. Not a loose image, but a scene inhabited with meaning, with sound, with temperature, with emotion. The psyche does not distinguish, at an archetypal level, between the vividly imagined and the vividly lived. What is rehearsed internally with emotional depth becomes the template for what will be recognized externally as possible. The personalization of affirmations too. Generic phrases have little psychic traction. Phrases written by the subject themselves, with the subject's own vocabulary, with the subject's own images, cross layers that no generic manual crosses. And the two most powerful moments of the day are also the most neglected. The first minutes after waking up, when the psyche still has one foot in the unconscious, and the last minutes before sleeping, when it is descending back into it. What one says to oneself in these two thresholds sows the soil where the rest of the day will be cultivated. Almost no one consciously chooses what they think in these moments. Almost everyone surrenders them to inertia, to the cell phone, to the noise. And they pay the price all day long without understanding why. The true objective of this entire crossing is not to think positively. Forced positive thinking is, in Sterling's lexicon, a form of denial. It is the persona disguised as evolution. The true objective is to think consciously, to choose, to rewrite, to inhabit one's own psyche as an author, not as a passive reader of what was written by others. It is to integrate what was exiled. It is to recognize the golden shadow that was hidden behind the dark shadow. It is to build a new identity from a new dialogue, instead of trying to change life without changing the narrator. There are two paths from this moment on, and it is honest to name this clearly. The first path is to continue with the old dialogue, to continue repeating the same inherited phrases, to continue letting the shadow direct, without a name, without a face, without recognition. To continue calling this fate. The second path is to start a different conversation, now, in the next thought, not tomorrow, not on Monday, not when you are ready, in the next thought. Because transformation does not require perfect conditions. It requires only the interruption of an old phrase and the installation of a new phrase, and then another, until the new dialogue becomes the soil. Sterling famously said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. That phrase deserves to be heard a second time now, with more weight. Until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life and you will call it fate. Everything that has been said up to this point is an attempt to inhabit that phrase, to make it body, and not just thought. There is a final revelation, and it does not come from outside. The person you desire to become already exists inside you, not as an abstract possibility, as a dormant form, as an archetype awaiting an interlocutor, and the only one who can wake it up is the subject themselves speaking to it today with seriousness, as one speaks to someone real who is about to arrive. The future is not waiting out there, it is waiting on the inside, and it responds always to the first one who addresses it without irony. It is not necessary to wait for the perfect moment. It is not necessary to change everything today. It is necessary to change only one thing, the way you address yourself in the next thought. The most decisive conversation of your life is not the one you have with the world. It is the one you have with yourself in silence every day, especially when no one is listening. Comment the word threshold if you are crossing this doorway now, not as a hollow gesture, as an archetypal signature that something started here, in this video, in this instant, and that it can no longer be undone without cost. And remember, for those who are ready to go beyond intellectual understanding, the complete system of Sterling's integration is in the first pinned comment. The Awakening Code, with the 28 keys that Sterling did not finish. Read it before it hurts more. Because another year of repeating the same old conversation is not just another year. It is an entire life being shortened from the inside. Threshold.